I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. I think others have already made the point that this budget debate is probably the most important that this Parliament has had since it was established some 17 years ago. And during that devolution referendum, the people of Scotland endorsed two principles. Firstly, a Parliament, and secondly, a Parliament with the ability to vary income tax. In 1999, John Swinney and his colleagues were elected on the promise that they would use the variable rate, as then was, to raise a penny for Scotland. That was at a time of rising investment in public services by the then Labour government. 3 years later, John Swinney, as leader of the SNP, dropped that policy, saying Gordon Brown has increased taxes and has put more money into the public purse. I'm now not sure if that was meant as a complaint. Today we find ourselves in a situation where two of the three largest parties, Labour and the SNP, are opposed to the UK Chancellor's ideological pursuit of austerity in the smaller state. The third party, the Scottish Conservatives, of course, support that approach, and they can put their case at the election. But since the election of the first coalition and now the current government, both Labour and SNP have been in broad agreement that the economic approach is wrong. Austerity means cuts to vital public services and a burden of pain which has been borne not by those with the broadest shoulders, but by those most reliant upon public services, those who work in public services, and their redundancies certainly are not being exaggerated, Deputy First Minister. Barely a question time goes by where government backbenchers don't invite Scottish ministers to blame the cuts that are taking place in Scottish communities today on the United Kingdom Government. Scottish ministers have, in all fairness to them, been consistent in calling for an alternative. They've also been consistent in the demand for more powers for Scotland, and they've asserted again consistently that any new powers would be used to combat austerity and defend the most vulnerable against the cuts. Calling for power, promising to use power, but little evidence of real shifts in spending to protect the services which are now most at risk. Because many of those services are provided by Scottish local government, services provided by Labour and SNP councils alike. COSLA says these cuts are wholly misguided and threaten grievous injury to communities. John Swinney says they're just exaggerating. The deal that members here complain about from the UK is in fact made worse and then passed on to Scottish communities by decisions taken here in Scotland's Parliament. MSPs present in this debate today are some of the first to then criticise local government for the cuts which they are voting for here today. That is wrong, Presiding Officer, and something needs to give. All across Scotland, charges are being introduced and increased on the most vulnerable service users. These charges aren't progressive. They fall on those with little choice but to find the money or to give up a service which until now they relied upon. They also fall on those without that choice, those who find the service that they relied upon simply closed to them or closed altogether. There is nothing progressive about this, Presiding Officer, and the fact that members here are both voting for these cuts and criticising them when their constituents complain is frankly more than inconsistent. The question for us today is what will we do now? The First Minister has said that education is her #1 priority. What good is education as a #1 priority when we refuse to protect school budgets? When music education has to be cut, when there are fewer classroom assistants, when there are reduced library services, education delivered to our children by the same local councils bearing the brunt of austerity in Scotland because of decisions taken here in Scotland's Parliament. This is wrong, Presiding Officer. No exaggeration that it is wrong. I cannot understand why a party that argued for a penny for Scotland in a time of rising public spending cannot even admit that progressive taxation might have a role to play in the circumstances our communities now face. This is in direct contrast to the withdrawal of services and charging for services which is happening now. Now, I accept the government's argument that variability of bands in taxation is needed too, and my party actually remains committed to using that variability to further increase the progressivity of the tax system. But I also agree with John Swinney, who told the Finance Committee that he does regard the Scottish rate of income tax as a progressive lever. The question then is the Scottish rate progressive, as some have tried to argue? It's not even does John Swinney still agree with himself. It is, do we accept that there is no alternative to austerity? Do we believe that we have the right to complain about our deal and refuse to contemplate raising further revenue, whilst at the same time enforcing a worse deal on councils, who we also then prevent from raising their own revenue? Why is this government so timid Where is the progressive politics that this country has been promised time and time and time again? Why is it that two parties who are opposed to austerity are going to vote differently on this budget tonight? Under successive budgets, Presiding Officer, we are not making our society fairer. We are simply making Scotland the best place to be born into privilege. And it is for that reason that I cannot support that, and I will not support this budget tonight.